All right, so last time way of review, sin is our first bubble here. The patriarchs who received the covenant, the promise, the contract, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they multiply through the 12 sons of Jacob. They're taken down into Egypt through Joseph's story. They multiply, they're fruitful, and they grow strong in the land. A leader is chosen by God in the book of Exodus, and that's Moses, and he leads his people out of the land. In the desert, the law is given to his people. That's this square here. But the people rebel over and over again. In fact, they rebel and they grumble and they complain and they don't trust God. And so Scripture tells us both in the Old and in the New Testament that their unbelief kept them out of the promised land. Everyone who was 20 years old or older during Moses' time dies in the wilderness over 40 years, so that when the book of Deuteronomy starts, it's a whole new generation. That's what the book of Deuteronomy is for, reminding the people what the law is and the expectations. And then finally, we see this beautiful next step in the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, when in step 8 of our 12 steps to a great nation, step 8 is the people come into the land, they cross the Jordan River, which would be here on our diagram. They set up headquarters at a place called Gilgal. They divide the territory in half, the country in half, through battles like Jericho and Ai. And then they start a southern campaign. That's Joshua chapters 1 through 12, driving out the inhabitants, the Canaanites, all the pagan peoples in the southern territory of what becomes Israel. And then they have a northern campaign in Joshua chapter 11. And then from then on in the book of Joshua is the distribution of the land. Each of the tribes is given a portion according to their size that was taken in the book of Numbers, one of the census. In Numbers, and we have a distribution. Last time we talked about how Joshua was kind of a rosy picture of what was going on. It kind of it was an overview. It kind of skipped some of the details. We actually see that in the book of Chronicles, the books of Chronicles. If you compare the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel to 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings on this side, 1st and 2nd Chronicles on this side, you'll see that they're the same stories. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles is actually kind of a more basic overview. They simplify sin. They tell the story. That book tells the story quicker because it has a different purpose. The purpose of the book of Chronicles is to summarize and probably a few other things. But the purpose of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is to get through the nitty-gritty details, which we'll see probably the next lesson that we have. And so they have different purposes, and we're seeing that here too in the book of Judges. Joshua was rosy, a lot of positive things happening, a lot of incredible things that God is doing. But when we come to the book of Judges, we see a very different story. So the book of Judges covers about 300 to 400 years. If you track, there's a lot of markers throughout the book of saying this person judged for this many years, and if you track all those, you get a few centuries. So we're back to hitting the fast forward button. Joshua was a little bit of a fast forward, but we're going to go even faster through the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 1, verse 1, after the death of Joshua, so now we have some context, right? We're immediately after the death of Joshua. The people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. So, a couple things are happening there. First, let's look at our checklist. Let me see if I have it here somewhere. There's Yoda. Let's just do this one. So we have our checklist of what makes a nation. We're going to go through it all over again just to make sure we're looking at it properly. The first step is to make a nation, we need people. Do we still have people? Yeah, we have the Israelites. They just walked into the land, so we got a check mark there. They still have the law. That doesn't end, so we'll keep the check there. They're still in the land, so we have a check there. But verse 1 indicates that the people are asking, Joshua's dead, now what do we do? we have an issue with who's the leader. So we've kind of taken a step backwards. Hopefully it's a progressive step forwards ultimately, but the question we should be asking is if God is still making a great nation, ultimately to bless that nation and to bless the whole world through the nation, we're still going to need a leader the whole time. Joshua succeeded Moses, and so that was a natural transition, but now we have a serious problem and there's no leader. So the people ask God, who's going to lead us? Who's going to fight the Canaanites? Because we're still dealing with Judges and Joshua are consecutive, but there's a little bit of intertwining. And so we'll see the first couple of chapters of Judges, even though we just read that Joshua died, Joshua is mentioned because it's not intended to be exactly chronological. And so the land isn't exactly distributed at this point, but it's mostly distributed. Most of the people have been driven out. And so the people are wanting to see the promise fulfilled, and they say, Lord, who's going to lead us and who's going to help us drive out the rest of the Canaanites? But the Lord doesn't pick a person. He picks Judah, which is, Judah is long dead. Now Judah is a tribe, one of the 12 tribes. So he says, Judah, you're going to go up and fight against these people. And that's the Judeans, or I think Judeans talk to the Simeonites in verse 3 there. It's written as if they were people, but they're actually tribes. Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me that we may fight the Canaanites. So now we see a little bit of collective working together amongst the tribes, but what we'll notice throughout the book of Judges is that none of the tribes are unified. They're all their own separate tribes. They don't really work together well. There are a few bright, shining moments. I'll talk about our next image on the chart more at the end. But what we're seeing is, this is still the allotment of the 12 tribes. These little white marks here are some of the tribes working together, but they're still very much sectioned off. They're still very much separate from one another. In fact, they treat one another very poorly at times. And so in chapter 1, they're working together. By the time we get to the end of Judges chapter 1, we see some scary things. Verse 21 starts us off. So the people of Benjamin go do something. It says, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. What's wrong there? What's going on? Why does the text say this? What are they supposed to do and why?
Drive out the people so they don't intermarry.
Yeah, they're not supposed to intermingle with the people. Why? Why can't we all just get along? Why? What? Huh? Yeah, what we read, I think, last time in Deuteronomy 6 is that if they start intermingling with the people, if they start intermarrying with the people, they're gonna be enticed by their gods, and they're gonna run away from Yahweh, the God that brought them out of Egypt. And so God drives the people out of the land. All these conquests that happen in Joshua is to drive the people out, so that we have a pure nation, so that we have people who understand that Yahweh is God. Yahweh is the one that brought us out of the land. Yahweh is the only God to be worshipped. All of these other gods are in submission to Yahweh. But if they leave the people here, if they leave the people in the land, they're going to start marrying, they're going to start getting along, they're going to start saying, wow, your God makes really good TikTok videos. I want to follow him. And that's exactly what starts to happen. So in verse 21, the first problem we see is that the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. And then we come to verse 27, still in Judges chapter 1. Manasseh, the tribe, did not drive out the inhabitants. Verse 28, the end of the verse, but they did not drive them out completely. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants. Verse 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants. Verse 32, they did not drive them out. Verse 33, they did not drive out the inhabitants. What's our theme? They didn't drive out the inhabitants. We have a huge issue going on, and it's that apparently they're too worried about offending these other nations or something, that they're not listening to the Word of God. They're not listening to what the exact thing that they're supposed to do, and we've already been told exactly what will happen if they don't drive out the inhabitants, which is exactly what has happened. So in chapter 2, the Lord's angel shows up, and in verse 2, he says, "You have not obeyed my voice," talking for the Lord. Verse 3, "So now I say, I will not drive them out." You didn't drive them out, so I will not drive them out. And they're going to become a thorn to your side. In verse 3, "Their gods shall be a snare to you." He already warned them of this, and now he says it's definitely going to happen. Verse 6 starts talking about Joshua. So this is where we see that intermingling of the chronology. Joshua is still alive in verse 6. And the people obeyed Joshua until he died in verse 8, and they buried him. But in verse 10, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, the generation that followed Joshua. And there arose another generation after them, here's the problem, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Remember those 12 stones on the edge of the river? Remember the covenant of circumcision? What was the purpose of those things?
To remember what God did for them.
Yeah, Passover too. So your sons will say, "Why do we do this thing? Why is that thing like that?" And the whole point is so that you will say, "This is what God did for us. This is where he brought us. This is what he does. This is who he is." But apparently they didn't do that, because in verse 10, there's a generation that comes after the ones who obeyed Joshua, and they do not know the Lord. The generation before them failed. We have seen this issue over and over again throughout history, but that's a side note. Verse 11, "The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." Verse 10, they don't know God. Verse 11, the result is they do evil in the sight of the Lord. Listen to some of these phrases. Verse 12, "They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers." The end of verse 12, "And they provoked the Lord to anger." Verse 13, "They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals." Verse 14, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers. He sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies." Verse 15, "The hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned." Verse 17, "They whored after other gods." There's a strong verb. Verse 18, "The Lord was they would sin, and the Lord would send a judge," and it says the Lord was with the judge. So these verses are setting up for us an outline for what we're going to see throughout the book of Judges. And it's this, that first the people are going to sin. They're going to forget God. They're going to rebel against him. And then because of that sin, they're going to be conquered. God's going to send another group of people, the ones they were supposed to drive out and didn't drive out. God's going to send them. They're going to be conquered. They're going to be ruled by another people in the land that was promised to them. And so what they're going to do is they're going to say, "Oh my goodness, Lord, we're so sorry. We'll do whatever you ask of us. We'll obey you. We'll be faithful." And so they sort of repent, and God sends them a judge, and that judge takes care of that group of oppressors. And then after the judge gives them salvation from their people, normally there's a period of rest and peace, and then the whole thing is going to start again. They're going to forget God, and they're going to sin all over again. But it's not just a cycle. In fact, it starts spiraling tighter and tighter and tighter, and the problems get bigger and worse. And that is what the book of Judges is all about. Chapter 2, verse 22 says, verse 21, "I will no longer drive them out." That's the same wording we looked at in chapter 1. Before any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. So there's the less rosy picture of Joshua. Joshua was responsible for not finishing the task. He was partly responsible. Verse 22, "The whole purpose, in order to test Israel by them." Verse 23, he's not driving them out. Chapter 3, verse 1, which is the next verse. "Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel." So he's testing his people. So we came to our checklist. We had this great system going on. We're checking off boxes. We have the people, we have the law, we have the land. We don't have a leader. We still have a problem. But with the judges, God is sending people who will deliver his people. And so we expect the judges to be that savior. But that spiral keeps tightening. And so we'll look at some of these things. Chapter 3 jumps very quickly. Becky mentioned it before class that that there's a lot of names in the book of Judges because we're hitting the fast forward button. We're showing that this spiral is tightening. We're showing that the issue is recurrent and worse each time. And so that's what happens. First, we come to Othniel. You'll have to read each of their stories, but if I can catch it quickly, he gave the land rest, chapter 3, verse 11, for 40 years. And so he was the judge. And then there's this left-handed dude named Ehud. He's the one that goes, King Eglon is a fat king, and he stabs the sword through Eglon. He pretends he has a secret message for him, and it goes up to the hilt, and ESV says his dung spilled out. It's a gross story, but again, little boys love the book of Judges. He gives the land rest for 80 years. Then we have this guy named Shamgar. He gets one verse at the end of chapter 3. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. I Googled a picture of an ox goad and tried to visualize him murdering 600 people. It doesn't look pretty. And it doesn't even say how long he saved Israel for. So he's just a quick view. Then we spend a little bit more time in chapter 5 with Deborah and Balak, who give the land rest for 40 years. And then we come to this man named Gideon in chapter 6. And it's so funny that now as the spiral has tightened, they're conquered by a group called the Midianites. And this man named Gideon, he's in a wine press in an enclosed room. So he's in the basement, and he's treading out, I think, wheat or something. Chapter 6, verse 11 says specifically that he was doing it to hide from the Midianites. He doesn't want them to get their stuff. He's probably a little bit scared. We'll see that as part of his personality. So here's this cowering guy in a basement doing his work, hiding, and the angel of the Lord shows up and says, "Oh, mighty man of Israel," or mighty man of valor, which is, I think, intended to be ironic. And God calls him to do something. He sneaks away at the end of chapter 6 at night because he's afraid of his own family, because he's afraid that if he goes against the pagan gods, his own family will turn him in or kill him. And so this mighty man of valor does that. At the end of chapter 6, he says to God, "I'm going to put some fleece on the ground, make it wet and the rest of the ground dry to prove to me that you're going to do what you say." There's some intentional language at the beginning of chapter 6 where it sounds a whole lot like Moses calling. So it almost seems like with Gideon, we might be seeing the prophet like Moses, but it turns out to not be the case. So this mighty man of valor says, "Make the fleece wet and the ground dry to prove to me that you're going to do what you say you're going to do through me." And God does it, and he says, "Okay, that was really cool, but now this time I need you to do it again, but make the fleece dry and the rest of the ground wet." And he keeps testing God, because it seems he's a little bit worried. And he's the one that takes a group of people, about, I think it's like 32,000 men, and dwindles them down to 300 men and starts fighting battles with these 300 men, which would be a cool movie, huh? And he gives the land 40 years of rest, and then he has 70 sons through different wives, and he has one son through a concubine, and that son's name is Abimelech, which means "my father is king." So imagine a prostitute who has a kid out of wedlock, and she names her kid, future Donald Trump or something like that, to show that their expectations or their connection with Gideon. And that man rises up against, after Gideon dies, that man rises up against the 70, and it becomes a mess. So we're trying to get this leader box checked off, but each time we have a temporary relief, but then that nasty cycle, and the people keep sinning, and we keep having issues. And none of these men who are judges, which is a judicial term, but in this case tends to be a war term, none of these men are doing what we need to get done. They're maybe doing the physical side of things, relieving the people of their pagan oppression, but they're not getting any closer to the blessing. We have, at the end of Gideon's story, chapter 9 is Abimelech, his son's story. Then we have two more judges, Tola, who gives peace for 23 years, Jair, who has 22 years. He has 30 sons, plus another son, And then Jephthah is in chapter. We pause a little bit and look at Jephthah in chapter 11, and he's the bastard son of a prostitute, and he gets kicked out of his family from his half brothers. But then things get bad because of their oppressors, because of the people's sin when they're conquered, and they go to Jephthah and say, "Hey, will you save us?" And he's like, "You kicked me out of the family. Why would I save you?" And they're like, "Yeah, just save us. Like that's why we came to you." And so he saves Israel, and he has a bunch of victories. And at one point he says to God, "If you give me victory over these people, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out to welcome me." What comes out is his daughter. And a lot of people want to take this text and say Jephthah did not kill his daughter as a vow. But if you're reading the story and understanding that the book of Judges is a dark side of history to show the wickedness of the people, and in the story it says that Jephthah did according to his vow. Let me see if I can find that quickly. Chapter 11, verse 39, he did to his daughter according to his vow. So he kills his daughter to fulfill this vow, this rash vow that he made to the Lord. What he should have done is just taken it back and done the lesser sin, I think, or just not made the vow in the first place. And so and that's only 6 years. We take I think 2 chapters to look at Jephthah, and he's cool and all, but he kills his own daughter, and it doesn't fix the problem that we're looking at. And it's only 6 years of history. And then we come to the end of chapter 12, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. They're all judges. 10 years, 8 years. And 7 years. Ibzan has 30 sons who he gives to foreign women, and he has 30 daughters that he takes foreign men to be their husbands, and it shows that intermingling of the Israelites with the pagans, as we were warned against. So these people are getting worse and worse. We're not getting any closer to the blessing. We have some serious problems going on with this, and so we slow down again for about 3 chapters with this man named Samson. Now you probably know at least details of the story of Samson, and he's treated as a hero, right? Well, he's not a hero. He has this miraculous birth from a lady who was barren, kind of flashback to some of our previous stories. And an angel comes and says, "You're going to have a kid." In chapter 13, verse 5, the angel says, "The child will be a Nazirite to God." This is a recall of, I think it's Numbers chapter 6. A Nazirite is someone who intentionally chooses a unique vow. We think Paul probably did this in the New Testament. You can't cut your hair. You can't drink alcohol, or I think even touch grapes. You can't touch anything dead. You can't eat or touch anything unclean. And it's a period of time where you're totally devoted to the Lord, and these things show that. You're above and beyond what a normal Israelite is called to do. Well, Samson is designated a Nazirite. He doesn't get to choose it, and he breaks all of those rules. And so the very beginning of Samson's story, he's not supposed to touch any dead things. A lion attacks him. He tears apart the lion, which is pretty awesome. And so he not only touches a dead thing, but causes a dead thing. Later, he comes back and sees that there's a honeycomb growing in the lion. He eats that honeycomb, which means he's touching something unclean. So now he's broken 2 of the rules against being a Nazirite. Then he makes this riddle to the Philistine. He marries a Philistine woman. He tells his parents, "She looks good in my eyes, and so let me marry her." And apparently it was a plan that the Lord was using to rescue the people. And the Lord redeems that decision. And Samson makes this riddle. He says, "If you can figure out my riddle, I'll give you 30 pieces of clothing. If you can't, you have to give me 30 pieces of clothing." He has another plan in mind. And his wife eventually tells the answer to the riddle is that a honeycomb grew inside of a lion. And I think it's in chapter 14 maybe. Chapter 14, verse 18, he says to the Philistines, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." He's referring to his wife there. I don't recommend using that term. And so he kills 30 men to fulfill his part of the vow. He takes their clothing and gives it away. And then because the Philistines are mad at Samson, his wife's father, so his father-in-law, gives his wife away to his best man that was in their wedding. And And then Samson gets really mad and kills 1,000 men. Or no, I think this is the time where he ties foxes' tails together, lights them on fire, and sets them off in a field. And then a little bit later, so we're in chapter 15 now, a little bit later, he'll kill 1,000 men in verse 15 with the jawbone of a donkey, which is also crazy. First of all, how do you find the jawbone of a donkey? Second of all, how do you kill with it? I got so many questions, but no answers. So he marries a foreign woman, he touches dead things, he eats unclean things, he sleeps with a prostitute, and then he again goes after a foreign woman named Delilah, and Delilah tries to figure out the source of his strength, and he says, tie me up with new ropes, tie me up with new bowstrings. One other thing, I can't remember what it is. And each time she tests him because she's working for the side of the enemy and says, Samson, they're coming to get you. And he breaks free because he's super strong. And then finally he tells her that my strength is in my hair, if you cut off my hair. Now, we tend to think that this is like some magical serum for Samson. But if you read the text, he doesn't think that his power is going to leave him when his hair gets cut. He jumps up just like before, thinking he's fine. But the Spirit of the Lord had left him. All the while we found out that in this wicked man, the Spirit of the Lord filled him to fulfill his own purposes, the Lord's purposes. And yet when the hair is cut, finally, apparently the Lord has enough. He takes his spirit from him, and Samson can't overpower his enemies. They gouge out his eyes, make him the entertainment for a bunch of Philistines, and they're sitting on apparently a roof with pillars, and he prays one final time. It says his hair is growing back to show that something is building, something is happening. He prays, Lord, give me your Spirit one more time. Let me do one last thing and let me die doing this thing. And so this blind Samson puts his hand on both pillars and pushes it down. It says 3,000 people died. In his death, he killed more people than in his life because the Spirit of the Lord returned to him one last time. So even Samson is just a mess. And that he ends chapter 16. And we come to the conclusion of the book in these three sections, chapters 17 through 18, chapters 19 through 21, chapters 22 through 25. And the reason I break it up like that is because we start to see repeated phrases. In chapter 17, verse 6, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's a summary statement showing what the book of Judges is all about. There's no king, so we have no unifying leader, and everyone's doing what they think is right. Okay, so that's 17 verse 6. Well, now in 18 verse 1, it uses the same phrase. In those days there was no king in Israel, saying the same thing. In chapter 19 verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel. And one more time, which we'll see at the end. So, quick snapshot of these chapters. This is the story of a man named Micah. Let me see if I remember this story correctly. Yeah. So Micah is this really cool guy who steals 1,100 pieces of silver from his mom. Okay. Real top-notch guy. And then he returns it to his mother, and his mother says, oh my goodness, you are such a good son. Let's use this silver to make a god. So we see that spiral tightening, the grossness of these people. And so Micah hires a Levite to be his priest. Because, remember, all of these tribes are still divided. We have no cohesion. We have no leader. We have no unifying principle. And so Micah hires a Levite to be his own priest over his house and over his homemade god. You see the wickedness in this book? And then a bunch of Danites show up and they take the priest and they say, don't you want to be a priest over an entire tribe, not over just one person? And in fact, we learn that the Danites, the tribe of Dan, still don't have land yet. They're looking for land. That's how they find the Levite. And so they get chased and they threaten the guy, saying, essentially, what are you talking about? We'll kill you if you keep talking. And so they make their own priest. They make their own Levitical system. They make their own laws. And it's gross. It's just wicked. It's a blatant misuse of what we saw in the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's messy. The summary is there's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They're making up the rules. They're making up what they want to do, and they're fitting it into their own worldview. So that's bad. It gets worse. In chapters 19 through 21, we have the story of another Levite, and he marries a concubine. And he goes down to, he doesn't want to live in the land, or he doesn't want to walk through pagan land. It's not safe. Those pagans are nasty people. So he goes to Bethlehem, and when he's in Bethlehem, they start to have to set up camp in the middle of the town square because no one will invite them in because he doesn't want to go to the pagans. They're gross, they're mean, they're not hospitable. Well, he finds out his own tribesmen, well, not his own tribesmen, his own Israelite brothers will not welcome him in until an old man shows up, welcomes him into his house, and while they're in the old man's house, the entire town comes out. They're all Benjaminites. They come out and they say, we want to have sex with these visitors that you have. And it's a gross story. It mimics the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is intentional. And so the old man, out of hospitality, says, no, here, I have virgin daughters, and this man has a concubine. Why don't you rape them? And so all night they rape this concubine until in the morning the Levite walks out. Remember, the Levite is the tribe that's the priest. They're religious leaders. The Levite walks out, finds his concubine on the doorstep, and he starts talking to her. Okay, let's go. You good? Let's roll. Well, she's been gang raped all night. And if that's not gross enough, he chops her up into 12 pieces and sends the pieces throughout the 12 tribes of Israel. In fact, the text never says that she was dead on the doorstep. She might have been living. Nonetheless, it doesn't matter. He chops this woman up, sends her out, and says, come fight with me against the Benjaminites, to the other 11 tribes. So we see increasingly that not only is there no cohesion, now the 11 are about to fight the 12th tribe, the Benjaminites. And so because the Benjaminites refuse to apologize for what happened to this concubine, and it's a gross story on both sides. And nonetheless, the 11 tribes come out and they go to fight Benjamin. This is in chapter 12. 11 verses 1, and so they seek the favor of the Lord as if they've been doing that the whole time, and the Lord says, send out, I think he says Judah, to fight the Benjaminites first, because they're the holy ones looking for the Lord's guidance. Well, the Judeans die, I think it's like 22,000 of them, because the Lord never says that they're going to win. In fact, he seems to be accomplishing his purposes by killing off the Israelites. And a second time, the same thing happens. Lord, what? They're weeping. You told us to send out these people to fight our own brothers, and yet they lost. Who should we send out? And so the Lord tells them who to send out, and the next day the same thing happens. Thousands of people die. Well, finally, they say, they're weeping, and they say, Lord, what are you doing? We're fighting for you, as if that were true. Who should we send to fight our brothers, the Benjaminites? And finally he says, okay, you're going to have victory tomorrow. Send these people. And I think it's 25,000 Benjaminites. One tribe, 25,000 people are killed. And so in a matter of one chapter, we see over 50,000 Israelites fighting one another to the death to show that we've gotten to nearly the center of this spiral. It is a disgusting story. I'm not going to be able to find it quickly, but if you look in those last couple chapters, somewhere in chapter 18 through 21, I don't remember where, there's a mention of this being Gershom, who is Moses' son. So it's again another time where the chronology is not perfect. It's an intermingling to show the people have always been this bad. It's not just when they get to the land. It's happened from the time of Moses. The book of Judges is showing us an actual picture of the hearts of God's people. He has been faithful. He has fulfilled his promises. But from the very beginning, this spiral started, and it just tightens and gets nastier and more wicked throughout the book of Judges, until we get to the end of Judges 21, the very last verse in the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That same verse that we saw starting in chapter 17. Everyone is doing evil. Everyone is doing wicked because they think that's right. So if you're paying attention, the three summary stories in the book of Judges. First, the homemade priest. Second, the raping of the concubine, which leads to almost the entire decimation of the Benjaminites. In fact, they have to take women from the pagan tribes around them so that the Benjaminites can repopulate. That's how bad it is. They're almost completely gone. Chapters 22 through 25 do not exist if you're paying attention. But if you turn to Ruth, verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." Literally, that's in the day that the judges judged. So it's showing us very clearly that the book of Ruth, the context of the book of Ruth, is the same context as the book of Judges. So we're in now that changes the way, hopefully changes the way that you look at the book of Ruth. That we're in the same context. So now we'll start talking about this image. This is still obviously the distribution of the 12 tribes. The darkness is to show the wickedness, the rampant sin of the people. And a couple times they work together and it seems okay, but mostly the book of Judges, represented by this picture, is rampant sin, to show from the very beginning until now, we still have that issue that we're talking about from Genesis 1 through 11, and that issue is sin. But we have a bright spot, and that's what this little star is, and that's in the book of Ruth. There's a woman named Naomi. She is, what tribe is she from? Judah, and she marries a man named Elimelech, and they have 2 sons. There's a famine. It drives them into pagan lands, the Moabites. So if you pay attention to the stories up to this point, some of the Moabites, the first, I think, Moabites that we saw was in Numbers 22 through 24, and that's when that dude named Balaam tries to curse Israel 3 times, the talking donkey. It's the Moabite king that hires him to curse the Israelites. And then that fat king, Eglon, who had the sword stabbed through him, he was a Moabite. Earlier, I can't remember in which book, the Israelites ask for permission to walk through the land of Moab, and the Moabites don't give it to them. So up to this point, we've seen some nasty Moabites, and that's where the people have to go. That's where Naomi and her family, her and her husband, her 2 sons, and because of the famine, they go to the Moabites and they marry Moabite women. So they're, breaking the same rules that we saw all throughout the book of Judges. We think the story is going to continue, right? Well, it turns out that this pagan woman, whose name is Ruth, married to one of the sons, is like one of the most righteous people in this time in history. I skipped over the fact that in Samson's story, Delilah, when Samson is tricking her over and over again, says, "How can you say you love me, but your heart is far from me?" Tell me that isn't a good summary of what's going on in the book of Judges. And yet here we have, that was the Israelites. Their hearts are far from God. And here we have this Moabitess. She's called a Moabitess like 7 or 8 times in the book of Ruth. And in the very beginning of the book, the 2 sons die, and Naomi's husband. All 3 of those men die. And so Naomi's like, "I'm going to go back to the land. I hear things are better over there. Why don't you guys stay here? I can't offer you anything. I can't offer you sons to continue on the line. I can't offer you anything. Just stay here." And the other one leaves, but Ruth says, "Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your God will be my God." So we've got a convert because apparently of the faithfulness of Naomi, this little lady who gets the small highlight in her own book, or in Ruth's book. And so Ruth stays with her and goes back to the land of Israel, and she starts working for this man named Boaz, who we find out is a kinsman redeemer, which means that he is part of their family, like a distant relative. And if he marries Ruth, or if he decides to buy the debt of Naomi, the land that she owns, he has to marry Ruth, and his children actually become Naomi's sons, or Naomi's grandchildren. They continue on the line of Naomi, not of Ruth and Boaz. And so it would be a challenging job. And so we see a pretty steamy scene between Ruth and Boaz in chapter 3, where he's sleeping and she lifts up the blanket, and it says, sat at his feet, which sometimes in the scriptures, feet is a euphemism for another part of the body, but I'm not sure if that's the case here or not. But it's a pretty hot and steamy scene. And then she leaves early. Boaz promises to be her redeemer, but there's one other guy in line. It's a good romantic drama. And so Boaz goes to this guy who's in line before him to marry Ruth and says, do you want this land? Naomi's selling it. And he says, oh yeah, I want the land. Well, if you buy the land, you have to marry Ruth. And he says this in front of elders and leaders of Israel. And the guy says, I can't do that. Apparently he has family or something. I'm not able to pass on my line through Ruth, or technically Naomi's line through Ruth. And so the good guy wins in the end. Boaz and Ruth get married. We have an interesting story, which I referred to in previous lessons in Ruth chapter 4, verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders, so this is the elders of Israel, said, we're witnesses. This is like the marriage ceremony between Boaz and Ruth. We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. I don't know if these elders forgot the story of Rachel and Leah and how nasty it was, or are just overlooking that to show the fact that from them came the 12 sons, sort of. And then they say, may you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. That's when Judah sleeps with his daughter-in-law because he thinks she's a prostitute in Genesis 38. So these elders of Israel seem to be misremembering the fact that they're talking about two very kind of gross stories in the scriptures, nonetheless, that the Lord used to build up his people. And so the people are, so Naomi's line is preserved, Boaz and Ruth are together, and we see this faithful pagan woman being the only bright spot in the book of Judges. So that's her star there. She's the only good thing that happens in the Judges story. We see themes of God's grace, translated kindness, which is the Hebrew word hesed, loving kindness, which is God's grace. We see that God is a reward and a refuge. We see the theme of blessing repeated throughout Ruth's story. It is very much contrasted to the book of Judges. We see God's faithfulness woven throughout it, especially to faithful people, even if they're pagans, even if they're not originally Israelites. God's hand is all through this book. But the big thing is not missing the bigger story. Remember, we're looking at the Bible as one story. Imagine our 8 other steps behind this, and the picture's getting bigger, right, on your diagram here. The bigger picture is not that we just saw this steamy romance movie, but that God is doing something big. He's not in a hurry. He's growing things, and we see that in verse 17. Starting in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child. She gives birth to a son. Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so the story is assuming you know that David is a very important character. And so this whole nasty story of Judges with the little bright spot of Ruth, not only was it showing the nasty sin of God's people and that horrible spiral, and reminding us that we're looking for a leader and not yet finding it, but the bigger picture is that God is still doing something through these nasty people, these wicked people, despite their sin. This incredible story of Boaz and Ruth coming together against all odds to give birth to a man who will give birth to a man who will give birth to the greatest king that Israel has ever had. And so we'll start to look at that story next time through the story of yet again another barren woman.